Hi, in this video I will talk about some of the barriers related to disability-related social protection schemes for people with disability. Around 15% of the population globally experience some kind of disability. Households with at least a person with disabilities are more probable to have higher levels of multidimensional poverty. Based on the flagship report by the United Nations, the higher poverty rate among people with disabilities is the result of the barriers that exist in society. Some of these barriers are discrimination, narrow educational and professional access, and exclusion from livelihood and social protection programs. Disability is associated with extra costs. Code has classified the disability-related costs into indirect costs, which is income loss as a result of barriers in education and employment, and direct costs. It stems from greater need for general goods and services such as private transport and other disability-specific services such as sign language interpretation. Based on Cooper and colleagues, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused hard economic conditions, which is mostly felt by those vulnerable groups, such as those with disabilities who are already living in poverty or at risk of poverty. The current crisis, thus, has shown the importance of disability-inclusive response in crisis. Vital information about the virus and public restrictions, for example, should be provided in an accessible way for people with intellectual and sensory impairments. Lowe and Schuring have defined social protection as the entirety of policies and programs that protect people against poverty and risks to their livelihoods and well-being. Based on the disability perspective, social protection schemes can be categorized as disability-specific schemes for people with disabilities, disability-relevant programs such as old age and veterans pensions, which are mostly used by people with disabilities, targeted programs with the capacity to work criteria, and the mainstream schemes, which are accessible for all people, such as the example of this one is child benefit. Except for 80% of developed countries, which invest at least 1% of the GDP in disability-specific schemes, almost all other countries spend less than 0.3% of their GDP for this matter. Three main characters of inclusive social protection can be considered: availability, access, and adequacy. Availability here means that inclusion means that the social protection systems of a country should address the needs of a diverse population throughout their life cycle. And access means all individuals must be under social protection coverage. For example, by using universal social protection schemes, such as universal health insurance. And adequacy here means that transfers should be adequate, or the duration of support should be long enough. From now on, we will discuss about barriers, such as barriers that people with disability face when they want to use social protection schemes, such as approaches to disability, stigma, and inability to work. The orientation of disability policies has changed drastically in the last decades, especially in Europe and North America. This shift from a welfare-based model is mostly towards a right-based or a rights model, which is called social model of disability. It concentrates on the equality rights of the individuals with disability and anti-discrimination policies. Unlike the traditional models, which are mostly medical model, the social model sees prejudicial attitudes and barriers such as the inaccessible workplace as the main reason for limited participation. In this view, disablement is a social phenomenon and not a medical fact. So, how can we measure the required support for each person with disabilities? This is where we need disability assessment. In many countries, the basis for this assessment is medical assessments, which only focus on health conditions and impairments. Medical assessment is an objective approach, but also faulty. Do you know why? Because it neglects the unique supports each person with disabilities needs and also the barriers they face. The current shift is toward identifying functional restrictions and or the support an individual needs to do daily activities. Traditionally, people with disabilities should seek medical certificate to be eligible for social protection schemes. But it has many disadvantages. This approach causes stigma, put pressure on medical staff, and also those people who live in remote areas without medical facilities. They face many barriers to get this medical certificate. Based on Goffman, stigma is an attribute which is deeply discrediting. Baumberg has highlighted the fact that stigma has various sides. One of them is personal stigma, which is a person's own feeling that claiming benefits conveys a devalued identity. Another side of it is a stigmatization, which is the perception that other people will devalue your identity. Claims stigma occurs during the process of claiming the benefit. It stems from lack of privacy when examining for medically or financially. Another source of it is the feeling of being monitored by the government employees. Baumberg continues that the source of claiming a stigma can be found in reciprocity norms, meaning that those who cannot reciprocate gifts, in this case perceiving social protection as a gift or handout, are prone to social penalties. Furthermore, the level of stigma is linked to the degree claimants perceive themselves as deserving recipients. Barreiros has found that getting older or being employed increases the likelihood of reporting personal stigma. The stigma behind claiming social benefits would lead to significant low take-up or a decrease in eligible applicants. In other words, welfare stigma should be regarded as not only a source of shame, but also a barrier to inclusion. Studies have found that the emotional impacts of poverty is more important than material concerns for people in poverty. Not considering stigma and its byproduct, shame, would be against human rights, as it means ignorance of protecting the dignity of those dealing with poverty. Okay, what can be the relationship between social protection schemes and participation? In many countries, to be eligible for disability benefits, one should prove the inability to work condition. This condition is considered to be a disincentive to work, which causes less productivity, job market exclusion, and social exclusion. If we want to go beyond inability to work condition, we need to change our understanding about disability and encourage participation. A new understanding of disability has emerged by the human rights approach to disability. It sees disability as a consequence of the interaction between barriers limiting participation and the individual with impairments. To address these limiting barriers, policies are required to remove obstacles, for example, by raising awareness, employing non-discriminatory policies, and increasing accessibility. And we need to provide support, for example, social protection programs or support services, assistive devices, or rehabilitation programs. Some nations have introduced two disability-related grants for income replacement for those who have lost their income because of the barriers they face, and the other grant is disability caused for disability caused expenses, which is not linked to employment. Let's take a look at South Africa policies regarding disability. Disability is defined as mental or physical disabilities lasting more than 6 months and causing work absence. The criteria is that applicants should show that their income is low and go through medical assessments. The medical assessment is done by medical officer in one of the South Africa Social Security Agency offices. And applicants would be categorized as having minimal, significant, or major impairments. And only major and significant impairments are eligible for this benefit. As a result of this policy, the participation rate in South Africa has decreased among people with disabilities. Nearly 96% of recipients of this grant are not participating in economic activities, while only 2% are self-employed. Those below 18 years old cannot benefit simultaneously from the child grant and the disability grant. Disability-related costs go beyond just medical care and impact the whole household. Therefore, a child with disability would need both grants. Disability requires separate support from birth to death, in addition to child and old age supports. Overall, it can be seen that South Africa employs a medical approach in defining disability, focusing on impairments. And to be eligible for the disability grant, individuals should prove the inability to work. This presentation suggests endorsing human rights approach to disability and introducing a new design that would not discourage people from working, such as having two disability-related grants, as discussed in this presentation. This action would reduce personal stigma, thinking that having impairments equals inability to work, or I don't deserve this grant as it is for people who cannot work, and stigmatization, thinking that people think I am lazy and as I am not working when I can. Looking at Canada's policies, disability is defined broadly as any severe or prolonged condition that limits daily activities. There are many disability-specific schemes, but most of them have the condition of inability to work or lost their career or cannot continue working. The impact of this criteria is evident in students with disabilities. These students who live with their parents work either part-time or full-time, receive funding awards, or hold teaching assistantships and or other assistantships are not eligible for disability grants. In other words, this condition is encouraging students with disability to not work even part-time or not study hard to get any scholarship or assistantships. Thank you so much for watching this video.